What if I told you there's a hidden communication system still running beneath a major European capital, one that can't be hacked, can't be intercepted, and was never meant for the public? Not a server, not the internet, something older, something physical. In the late 1800s, millions of messages were being shot through underground tubes at high speed, faster than anything on the streets above. Governments used it, spies relied on it, and then one day, they told everyone it was obsolete. Shut it down, forgotten. Except, they didn't, because decades later, long after email, satellites, and encrypted networks took over, this system was still being used by the highest levels of government. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. If this obsolete technology was truly useless, why did they keep it running in secret for 20 more years? And even today, why does it still exist? I wasn't looking for anything hidden. At least, that's what I told myself. It started as a routine dive into one of France's most infamous scandals, the Dreyfus affair. A case every historian thinks they understand. A Jewish army captain accused of treason, a forged narrative, a country split in half. I had read about it before. Everyone has. But this time, I wasn't reading summaries. I was digging through fragments, transcripts, reconstructed evidence, overlooked details buried in footnotes. No one bothers to check anymore. That's where I found it. A torn piece of paper, blue. They called it the Petit Bleu. At first glance, it didn't look important. Just another document recovered by French intelligence. According to records, it had been pulled from a wastebasket belonging to a German military attaché, shredded, discarded, almost erased. But someone had taken the time to piece it back together, and what they reconstructed changed the entire case. The note wasn't addressed to Dreyfus. It pointed to another man, the real traitor. That alone should have been enough to hold my attention, but it wasn't, because something about the document didn't feel right. It wasn't the handwriting, it wasn't the content, it was the format. The paper was too small, too standardized, too mechanical. This wasn't a letter. It wasn't a telegram either. I kept staring at the reconstruction, comparing it to known formats from the late 19th century. Military correspondence, civilian mail, telegraph slips. Nothing matched. Until I found a single line in an archive description, easy to miss, almost an afterthought. Transmitted via pneumatic dispatch. I stopped reading. Pneumatic, as in air pressure. That didn't make sense. Not in this context. Not in the 1890s. Not for something tied to espionage. Unless I started digging again. Not into the case this time, but into the method. And that's when the story stopped being about a wrongfully accused man and started becoming something else entirely. Because buried beneath Paris, beneath the streets, beneath the noise, beneath everything people think they know about how the world worked back then, there was a network. Not wires, not signals, but physical messages, traveling through underground tubes at high speed, invisible to anyone above ground. A system so widespread, so efficient, it carried millions of messages every year. And somehow, almost no one remembers it existed. I leaned back from the screen, staring at that single phrase again, pneumatic dispatch. If this was real, if messages in one of the most important espionage cases in history were sent through an underground network no one talks about anymore, then I wasn't just looking at a forgotten detail. I was looking at the edge of something much bigger, something that had been hiding in plain sight for over a century. I didn't jump to conclusions right away, but something was off, and the more I looked into it, the harder it was to ignore. That phrase, pneumatic dispatch, kept coming back. It wasn't decorative language, it wasn't metaphor, it was literal. Messages weren't just written and delivered, they were physically shot through tubes using air pressure. That means somewhere under Paris, at the time of the Dreyfus affair, there had to be a working system designed to move information without relying on wires or people walking the streets. So I started tracing it, piece by piece, not through theories but through records, old infrastructure maps, postal archives, engineering notes, and the deeper I went, the clearer it became. This wasn't some experimental tool used once or twice. It was a full system, organized, scaled, and heavily used. Not hidden, just forgotten. By the late 1800s, Paris already had a network of metal tubes running beneath the city, connected to government offices, financial centers, and communication hubs. Messages were written on standardized forms, sealed inside small cylindrical containers, and sent through these tubes at high speed using compressed air. No electricity needed to transmit the message itself, no signal to intercept, just a physical object moving from point A to point B underground. It sounds simple, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it powerful. There's nothing to hack, nothing to tap into remotely. If you want the message, you have to physically intercept the system, and that's a different kind of problem entirely. And suddenly, that small blue paper from the case didn't feel small anymore. It meant that critical information, in one of the most sensitive espionage cases in French history, was being transmitted through a system that bypassed the normal channels. People expect no telegraph lines, no postal routes, nothing visible. Just tubes beneath the city, moving messages quietly while everything above ground looked normal. That changes how you see the whole thing. Because now it's not just about who sent the message or what it said, it's about how it moved and who had access to that movement. Systems like that don't get built for convenience alone. They get built for control, for speed, for security. And if it was already this, which raises a simple question, if something this large, this useful, this integrated into daily operations could disappear from common knowledge, what else slipped through the cracks with it? At this point, I stopped treating it like a curiosity and started treating it like a problem, because the more I looked at it, the less it made sense in the way we're used to thinking about history. We're told technology moves forward in a straight line, old things get replaced by better things, and once something is outdated, it disappears. But this didn't fit that pattern. This system wasn't primitive, it was efficient, fast, and more importantly, reliable in a way modern systems still struggle to guarantee, and yet, almost no one talks about it. That's not normal. So I kept digging, not into how it worked, but into what happened to it. When did it stop? Who shut it down? And why? The official answer is simple on paper. It became obsolete, too expensive, replaced by newer communication like fax and digital systems. That's the explanation you'll find if you stop at the surface. But if you follow the timeline closely, it starts to crack. Because while the public system was eventually shut down, the internal network used by government offices didn't disappear at the same time. It kept running, not for a short transition period, not for cleanup, but for years after it was declared unnecessary. That's the part that doesn't sit right. If something is truly obsolete, you don't keep it alive in the background. You don't maintain it quietly while telling everyone else it's no longer useful. That only happens when a system still has value, just not for everyone. And that shifts the whole perspective. Now, it's not just a forgotten piece of infrastructure. It starts to look like something that was pushed out of public awareness while still being used where it mattered most. And once that idea settles in, it's hard to shake, because it forces you to look at the past differently. Not as a timeline of progress, but as layers. Some things move forward, some things get buried, and some things never really go away. They just stop being visible. And if a network like this could exist, operate at scale, and then quietly fade out of common knowledge while still functioning behind closed doors, then the real question isn't how it worked. The real question is why we were so quick to forget it, and more importantly, who benefits from that kind of forgetting. To understand why this system even existed, you have to step away from the mystery for a second and look at the situation Paris was facing back then, because the truth is, nothing like this gets built without pressure. And Paris in the mid-1800s was under pressure. Communication was breaking down, not because people didn't have technology, but because too many people were using it at the same time. The electric telegraph had already spread across the city, connecting offices, businesses, government departments, and for a while it worked exactly as promised, fast, direct, efficient. But success created its own problem. Traffic exploded, messages piled up, lines got overloaded. What was supposed to be instant started slowing down. And when systems slow down in a city like Paris, everything feels it. Finance, administration, coordination, all of it depends on timing. At one point, the volume got so bad that messages had to be physically transported between stations just to keep things moving, loaded onto carriages, pushed through crowded streets, stuck in traffic like everything else. Think about that for a second. A communication system that was invented to eliminate delay ended up depending on horses and road conditions. That's not a small inconvenience. That's a failure, at scale. And the people in charge knew it. They couldn't just expand the telegraph endlessly. The infrastructure wasn't built for that kind of load. And even if it was, it still relied on signals that could be interrupted, delayed, or intercepted. They needed something faster, something more controlled, something that didn't rely on what was happening above ground. That's where the idea started to shift. Instead of sending signals through wires, what if you sent the message itself? Not a copy, not a code, the actual physical document, sealed, intact, moving through its own dedicated path. No traffic, no interference, no waiting. It sounds obvious now, but at the time, it was a completely different way of thinking. And once that idea took hold, it stopped being a question of possibility and became a question of execution. Because if you could build a system like that, one that bypasses the chaos of the streets entirely, then you're not just improving communication, you're controlling it. And control, especially in a city like Paris, is never just about convenience. Once the idea was clear, the rest came down to one thing, making it real. And that's where it gets interesting, because on paper it sounds simple, just tubes and air pressure, but building that under a city like Paris in the 1860s was not simple at all. You're dealing with narrow streets, old foundations, existing sewer systems, and a city that never really stops moving. But they went ahead anyway. They started laying down metal tubes beneath the streets, running them through the same underground space as the sewers, threading them carefully between structures that were never designed to share that space. These weren't large tunnels you could walk through. They were tight, enclosed pipes, just wide enough to carry small cylindrical containers. And inside those containers, that's where the message sat, sealed, protected, and ready to move. The real trick wasn't the tube itself, it was the force pushing the message through it. They used compressed air, generated by steam-powered machines, to either push or pull the container from one station to another. That means every segment of the network had to be carefully controlled, pressure balanced, timing coordinated, because if something went wrong, if the pressure dropped or spiked, the entire line could stall. And yet, it worked. Not perfectly at first, but well enough to prove the concept. The first line they built wasn't long, just about a kilometer, connecting key points where speed actually mattered. And when they tested it, the result was immediate. Messages that would take far longer above ground moved through the system quickly, cleanly, without interruption. No traffic, no delays, no human error once it was inside the tube. That was the moment everything changed. Because once you prove something like that works even on a small scale, expansion becomes inevitable. You don't build a system like this just to leave it as a demonstration. You build it because it solves a real problem, and more importantly, because it gives you an advantage. And that advantage isn't just speed, it's reliability. It's control over the path your information takes. Above ground, anything can interfere. Below ground, inside a sealed system, you decide how it moves, when it moves, and who it reaches. And once that kind of control exists, people in power don't ignore it. They invest in it. That's exactly what happened next. After the first successful tests, there was no hesitation. They didn't treat it like an experiment anymore. They treated it like infrastructure. Expansion started quietly, but steadily. More lines, more stations, more connections between places that actually needed fast communication. Government offices, financial centers, administrative hubs, the kind of locations where delays cost real money or real power, and the system adapted as it grew. It wasn't just about moving messages fast, it was about making the process consistent. Standard forms were introduced, so every message fit the system perfectly, no guessing, no adjustments. Containers were designed to seal tight, to move smoothly through the tubes without getting stuck. Stations were set up to receive, redirect, and dispatch messages in a controlled flow. This wasn't chaos, it was organized, almost mechanical in how precise it became. And the people running it understood that the value wasn't just in speed, it was in predictability. You knew how long a message would take, you knew where it would go, and you knew it wouldn't be touched in between. That kind of reliability changes behavior. Once people trust a system like that, they start depending on it. And that's exactly what happened. Usage increased, not slowly, but rapidly. What started as a solution to a bottleneck became a preferred method of communication for certain types of messages, especially the ones that couldn't afford delay or exposure. And here's the important part. This all happened before it was ever open to the general public. For years, this network was operating primarily for internal use, connecting offices of power, moving information where it needed to go without drawing attention. That tells you something about its purpose from the beginning. It wasn't built as a public service first. It was built as a controlled system, and only later did it expand outward. By the time civilians were allowed to use it, the core network was already in place, already tested, already trusted by the people who mattered most. And from that point on, growth wasn't optional anymore, it was expected. Because once a system like this proves its value, especially to those in control, it doesn't stay small, it spreads, it integrates, and it becomes part of how the city actually functions, whether people realize it or not. At some point, I stopped looking at it as a concept and started looking at it like a system you could actually use, step by step, because that's where you really understand how serious it was. A person writes a message, not on any random paper, but on a standardized form made specifically for this network. Small, compact, easy to handle. They take it to a station, or drop it into a designated box. From there, it doesn't sit in a pile waiting for someone to sort it. It gets processed almost immediately. The message is rolled or folded, placed into a cylindrical container, sealed, and loaded into the system. Once it enters the tube, that's it. No one touches it again until it reaches the other end. The movement is controlled by air pressure, strong enough to push the container forward at high speed, but stable enough to keep it from getting damaged. It travels through a network of interconnected lines, switching directions at stations where operators manage the flow, routing each message toward its destination. There's no guesswork, no wandering path, everything is directed. When it arrives at the closest station to the recipient, it doesn't just sit there. A courier picks it up almost immediately and completes the final leg, on foot, by bicycle, whatever is fastest at the time. So even though the system is underground, it connects directly to the real world above. That's the part people miss. This isn't isolated technology, it's integrated. It works with human movement, not against it. And when you add it all together, the full journey from sender to receiver can happen in a matter of hours, sometimes faster, across an entire city. For that time period, that's not just efficient, that's ahead of everything else available, and more importantly, it's consistent. You don't have to worry about traffic jams, weather, or random delays once the message is inside the system. It moves the same way every time. That kind of consistency builds trust, and trust is what turns a system into something people rely on daily. And once people rely on it, it stops being optional. It becomes part of the rhythm of the city, something running in the background, doing its job quietly, while most people don't even think about how it works. But the ones who understood it, the ones who depended on it the most, they knew exactly what they had. Once the system proved it could move messages reliably, the real impact showed up in how fast things started to happen, and not just in theory, but in everyday use. Before this, even with telegraph lines, there were delays, queues, bottlenecks, human handling at multiple points. But here, once a message entered the network, it didn't wait, it moved, and it moved fast enough to change expectations. People didn't think in terms of later anymore, they started thinking in terms of soon. Businesses adjusted first, especially finance. Timing matters there more than anywhere else. A delay of even minutes can change outcomes, decisions, money. With this system, information could move across the city without being slowed down by street conditions or human traffic. That gave an edge to anyone who used it properly. Government offices followed the same pattern. Internal communication became tighter, more controlled, more predictable. Orders could be sent and received within a known time frame, not guessed, not hoped for, but expected. And once expectations shift, systems that can't keep up start to fall behind. That's how this network gained ground, not by replacing everything at once, but by doing one thing better than anything else available at the time, moving physical information quickly and consistently. And here's the key point. It didn't rely on fragile signals. No wires to cut, no interference from outside forces. As long as the tubes were intact and the pressure systems were running, messages kept moving. That kind of independence matters more than people realize. It means the system can operate even when other forms of communication struggle or fail. And when you think about that in the context of a large city, with political tension, economic pressure, and constant activity, you start to see why this wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. It gave certain people a way to move information without exposing it to the same risks everyone else had to deal with. And once that advantage becomes clear, it doesn't stay neutral. It gets used, refined, and protected, because speed alone is valuable. But speed combined with control, that's something else entirely. At a certain point, this system stopped being impressive and started being normal, and that's when you know it fully took hold. People weren't talking about how it worked anymore. They were just using it because it got results. Messages that needed to move fast went into the tubes. No hesitation. No second guessing. Offices built their routines around it. Clerks knew exactly when to send, when to expect a reply, how long each route would take. It became part of daily workflow, like turning on a light or opening a door, something so consistent you don't question it. And the scale kept growing. More stations were added, more lines connected different parts of the city, and the network spread out quietly under everything. From the surface, nothing looked different. Streets were still crowded, people still moved the same way, but underneath, there was constant motion, containers moving back and forth, carrying information non-stop. That contrast is important because it shows how disconnected perception can be from reality. Most people above ground had no idea how much activity was happening below their feet. And the ones who did know, they weren't advertising it. They didn't need to. The system spoke for itself through reliability. When something works every time, you stop needing to explain it. And over time, that reliability turns into dependence. Certain types of communication started defaulting to this network because nothing else could match it in terms of consistency. Not just speed, but certainty. You knew it would arrive. You knew it wouldn't be tampered with in transit. That level of trust is rare, especially in systems that handle important information, and once that trust is established, it changes behavior at a deeper level. People start organizing decisions around it, timing actions based on it, building processes that assume it will always be there. That's when a system becomes critical, not because it's new or impressive, but because everything starts leaning on it without realizing how much weight it's carrying. And when something like that is in place long enough, it fades into the background. It becomes invisible, not because it's hidden, but because it's expected. And that's exactly what happened here. It didn't disappear. It just blended in so well that people stopped seeing it altogether. Once the system proved it could handle real demand, expansion didn't come with big announcements or public attention. It just kept growing in the background, steady and deliberate. New lines were added where they were needed most, not randomly, but with purpose. Key districts got connected first, places where information moved constantly and delays had real consequences. Government buildings, financial centers, administrative offices, all tied together through a network no one could see from the surface. And the growth wasn't chaotic. It followed a structure. Lines were mapped carefully, stations positioned to keep flow efficient, pressure systems calibrated to maintain speed without breaking the rhythm. This wasn't something thrown together, it was engineered to scale. And as it scaled, it started covering more ground than people realized. What began as short connections turned into a web stretching across the city, linking areas that normally relied on crowded streets and slow movement. Down below, everything moved differently. No traffic, no interruptions, just a controlled environment where messages followed a path that had already been decided. That kind of setup changes how a city operates, even if most people never notice it directly. Because when communication improves, everything built on top of it becomes sharper. Decisions happen faster, responses come sooner, coordination tightens. And all of that feeds back into the system, increasing demand, pushing it to expand even further. It becomes a cycle. The more useful it is, the more it's used. The more it's used, the more it needs to grow. And through all of that, it stays quiet. No spectacle, no attention, just steady integration into the core of how things get done. That's why it lasted. Not because it was flashy, but because it worked. And it kept working without needing to be seen. By the time it reached its peak, the system wasn't just part of the city. It was running through it like a second layer people couldn't see. Hundreds of kilometers of tubes stretched beneath Paris, connecting over 100 stations, moving millions of messages every single year. Not occasionally, not in bursts, but constantly. Day in, day out. A steady flow of information traveling under the streets while life above kept going as usual. And what stands out isn't just the size, it's the volume. At its height, tens of millions of messages were being sent annually. That's not a niche service, that's mass usage. That means businesses relied on it, institutions depended on it, and regular people used it, because it worked. The system had reached a point where it wasn't just efficient, it was expected. You needed to send something quickly across the city. You used this. No debate, no alternatives that could match it in the same way. And even as technology kept advancing above ground, telephones spreading, new communication methods appearing, this network didn't just disappear. It held its ground because it offered something different. Not just speed, but certainty. A physical message moving through a closed system, not a signal that could be lost or misdirected. And that difference mattered more than people realized. Because when systems evolve, they don't always replace each other cleanly. Sometimes they overlap, each doing what the other can't. That's what was happening here. While newer technologies handled certain types of communication, this system kept handling the kind that needed reliability above everything else, and as long as that need existed, the network stayed relevant. It didn't need to be modern in the way people think about modern, it just needed to keep delivering results. And it did, quietly, consistently, without drawing attention to itself. That's how it reached its peak, not through hype, not through visibility, but through function. It did its job so well that it became part of the city's foundation, something woven into daily operations so deeply that people stopped noticing it was even there. And when something reaches that level, it doesn't feel temporary anymore. It feels permanent. The more I looked at how the system grew, the clearer one thing became. It was never truly designed with the public as the priority, even when people started using it later on. From the beginning, the most important connections were between places that held power. Ministries, administrative offices, decision-making centers, those were the first to be linked, and they stayed at the core of the network, no matter how much it expanded outward. When access opened up to civilians, it looked like a public service, but the structure underneath didn't change. The main lines were already in place, already optimized for internal communication. Everything else was built around that. And then there was something even more telling, a separate layer within the same system. A parallel network that didn't mix with public traffic at all. Dedicated lines, reserved strictly for government use, running between key institutions without interference. Messages in those lines didn't compete for space, didn't get delayed by volume, didn't share routes with anything else. They moved directly, cleanly, with a level of priority no public user could access. That kind of separation isn't accidental. It's deliberate. It means whoever designed and maintained the system understood that not all information should move the same way. Some messages are routine, others are critical, and the critical ones need a path that stays protected no matter what. And once that separation exists, you start to see the system differently. It's not just infrastructure anymore, it's hierarchy built into physical form. Different layers, different access, different levels of control. Above ground, everyone shares the same streets, the same traffic, the same delays. But below ground, inside this network, movement is controlled, prioritized, and segmented. And that tells you something about its real purpose. It wasn't just about making communication faster for everyone. It was about making sure the most important communication never had to depend on everyone else. And that difference matters because it explains why certain parts of the system were protected more carefully, maintained more consistently, and kept running even when other parts started to fade. When something is built around priority instead of equality, it doesn't disappear the same way. It gets preserved where it matters most, even if everything else around it changes. At some point, the public system and the internal system stopped being the same thing, even if they looked like they were part of one network. On the surface, everything was unified. One set of tubes, one service people could access, one flow of messages moving through the city. But underneath that, there was a split, quiet, controlled, and very intentional. Certain kutut weren't shared. Certain routes didn't appear on public maps. They existed only to connect specific buildings, specific offices, specific people. And once you see that, you understand the system wasn't just built for efficiency, it was built with boundaries. Messages from the public had to follow the general flow. They could be delayed, redirected, processed, along with everything else. But inside the internal network, movement was direct. No waiting behind civilian traffic, no mixing, no risk of interference. It was a clean path from one point of power to another. That kind of separation creates two realities operating at the same time. One visible, one not. And the difference between them isn't just speed, it's control. In the public layer, the system serves the city. In the private layer, the system serves authority. And that changes how you think about the whole structure, because now it's not just a communication network, it's a controlled environment where information is handled differently depending on who is sending it and where it's going. That's not something that happens by accident. It requires planning, resources, and a clear understanding of what needs to be protected. And once that kind of system is in place, it becomes part of how power operates behind the scenes. Not visible, not discussed openly, but always there, always running. And the people inside it don't question it, because for them, it's normal. They expect messages to move that way, fast, direct, uninterrupted. They rely on it without thinking about what it looks like from the outside. And that's where the gap forms, between those who know the system exists in full and those who only see a small part of it or don't see it at all. And once that gap is there, it doesn't close easily. It just becomes another layer in how things actually work, hidden in plain sight. At first, it might sound like overkill, building and maintaining a separate network just for internal communication. But when you look at the conditions back then, it starts to make sense in a very practical way. Cities weren't stable all the time. There were protests, unrest, sudden disruptions that could block streets or shut down normal movement without warning. Above ground, everything could be interrupted. Roads could be crowded, monitored, even controlled by groups outside the system. But below ground, inside a sealed network, none of that mattered. The tubes didn't care what was happening on the surface. As long as the system was intact, messages kept moving. That alone is a huge advantage. But it goes deeper than that. Think about interception. Any message that travels through open channels, whether it's carried by a person or transmitted through wires, can be intercepted at some point along the way. It can be delayed, copied, altered, or blocked. But with a sealed physical system, the message is contained from start to finish. There are only a few access points, and each one is controlled. If you want to interfere, you have to physically break into the system, and that's not something you can do quietly or easily. That level of security isn't theoretical. It's built into how the system works, and that's exactly why it was trusted. Not because it was modern or advanced in the usual sense, but because it removed variables. No signal loss, no external interference, no unknown routes. Everything was defined, contained, and predictable. And for government communication, especially in sensitive situations, that kind of predictability matters more than anything else. It's not about convenience, it's about certainty. You send something, and you know it will arrive exactly where it's supposed to, without being seen or touched along the way. That's the kind of reliability people in power don't give up easily. Once they have it, they keep it, they maintain it, even when newer systems appear, even when public attention shifts elsewhere. Because newer doesn't always mean safer. And in situations where information is critical, safety isn't optional. It's the baseline. That's why this system wasn't just used, it was relied on. And once something reaches that level of trust, it doesn't just disappear when trends change. It stays, quietly, in the background, doing its job long after people assume it's gone. The more you look at it, the more you realize this system wasn't just built to work under normal conditions. It was built to keep working when things go wrong. Not small problems, but real disruptions, the kind that shut cities down or throw everything into chaos. Above ground, communication depends on too many variables: people, traffic, infrastructure, even politics. Any one of those can fail, and when they do, everything slows down or stops. But down below, inside a sealed network with controlled entry points, those variables don't exist in the same way. The tubes don't get stuck in traffic, they don't get blocked by crowds, and they don't rely on signals that can be jammed or cut. As long as the physical structure is intact, the system keeps moving. That's a completely different level of resilience. And it explains why it was treated differently from other forms of communication. This wasn't just about speed or efficiency anymore, it was about continuity, the ability to send and receive information, even when the rest of the city is struggling. And once a system proves it can do that, it becomes more than useful. It becomes essential in ways people don't talk about openly. Because systems like that aren't meant to draw attention, they're meant to be there when everything else fails. That's why certain parts of it were maintained so carefully, even as other technologies started taking over the public space. You don't shut down something that can carry your most critical communication through a crisis. You keep it ready, you keep it running, even if it looks outdated from the outside. And that's where the difference between appearance and function becomes clear. From the outside, it might look old, unnecessary, replaced by newer tools. But from the inside, from the perspective of the people who rely on it when things get serious, it's still one of the most dependable systems they have. And that kind of dependability doesn't get replaced easily. It gets preserved, protected, and kept out of sight. Because the moment something like that becomes widely understood, it also becomes a target. So instead of promoting it, they let it fade into the background. Not gone, just quiet. Still there, still working, just no longer part of what people think about when they imagine how communication works. And that's exactly how something important disappears without actually going anywhere. Then came the moment where everything, at least on the surface, was supposed to end. The announcement was straightforward, almost predictable. The system was being shut down. Public use would stop. The reason given was simple and clean. Technology had moved on. New methods were faster, cheaper, easier to maintain. Fax machines, digital communication, modern infrastructure, all of it made this old system unnecessary. That's the story that was presented, and for most people, it made sense. It fit the pattern everyone expects. Old technology gets replaced, people move on, and whatever was used before fades away. No drama, no questions. But when you look at how it actually happened, it doesn't feel that clean. Because shutting down a system like this isn't just flipping a switch. You're talking about hundreds of kilometers of infrastructure, stations, equipment, routines built around it for decades. That doesn't just disappear overnight. And more importantly, the timing doesn't fully line up with the explanation. Yes, newer technologies existed, but they didn't replace everything equally. They introduced new possibilities, but they also brought new risks. Signals could be intercepted, systems could fail in ways this older network never did, and yet the decision was made to close it to the public anyway. That's the part that feels controlled, not chaotic, not forced by failure, but deliberate. A clear cut between what people could access and what they couldn't. From one day to the next, something that had been part of the city's communication flow for generations was declared unnecessary, and just like that, it was removed from everyday life. People adjusted, like they always do. They switched to newer tools, followed the shift, and stopped thinking about what came before. That's how it usually works. But here, there's a gap between the explanation and the reality underneath it. Because when something this reliable, this integrated, this proven gets shut down, you expect a clean replacement that does everything better. And that's not exactly what happened. Some things improved, yes, but not everything. And that leaves a question hanging in the background. Was it really about replacing the system, or was it about changing who had access to it? If the story ended with the shutdown, it would make sense. Old system out, new system in, nothing unusual. But it didn't end there. Because while the public network was being closed, the internal lines didn't disappear at the same time. They kept running. Not loudly, not officially announced, just quietly maintained in the background. And not for a short period either. Years passed, then more years, and the system was still in use where it mattered most. That's where the explanation starts to fall apart. If something is truly outdated, you phase it out completely. You don't keep part of it alive for decades unless it still serves a purpose that newer systems can't fully replace. And that's exactly what this looks like. The public layer was removed, access cut off, usage stopped. But the core, the part that connected key institutions, that part stayed intact, maintained, operated, relied on. That tells you the value didn't disappear, it just became restricted. And once you see it that way, the whole situation shifts. It's no longer about technology becoming obsolete, it's about access being narrowed. What used to be available to many became reserved for a few. And it wasn't obvious, because most people had already moved on. They had new tools, new systems, new habits. They didn't feel the absence because something else filled the gap. But that doesn't mean the original system lost its value. It just means its role changed. And the people who understood that value didn't abandon it. They held on to it, quietly, without drawing attention. That's how something continues to exist, without being part of everyday awareness. It doesn't need to be visible to function. It just needs to be maintained where it counts, and in this case, it clearly was. Which brings you back to a simple point. If a system is still being used long after it's declared unnecessary, then the official explanation isn't the full story. There's another layer behind it, one that doesn't get written down as clearly, but shows itself through what continues to operate when no one is supposed to be looking. What makes this harder to ignore isn't just that the system kept running, it's how quietly it did. There was no effort to explain it, no public discussion, no clear statement saying, this part is still active for internal use. It just continued in the background while everything above ground moved on. And that silence matters, because when something is phased out normally, there's a transition period, documentation, visibility. People know what's happening, even if they don't pay attention. But here, the shift was one-sided. Public access was cut, the narrative was set, and after that, the rest was left unspoken. And that tells you it wasn't meant to be part of public awareness anymore. Not because it stopped working, but because it was no longer meant for everyone. The system didn't need to be explained to the people using it internally. They already understood its value. For them, nothing really changed. Messages still moved the same way, through the same controlled paths, with the same reliability. The only difference was who could use it. And once that boundary is in place, it doesn't get advertised, it gets maintained. Quietly, consistently, without drawing attention. Because attention creates questions, and questions lead to scrutiny. And when something is still useful but no longer public, the last thing you want is unnecessary focus on it. So it fades, not physically, but in awareness. People stop talking about it, stop teaching it, stop including it in the story of how communication evolved. It becomes a footnote at best, something mentioned briefly and then ignored. But that doesn't mean it's gone. It just means it's no longer part of the version of reality most people are given. And that's where it gets uncomfortable. Because now you're not just looking at an old system that outlived its time, you're looking at a system that was selectively removed from public view while continuing to operate where it mattered. And that's a different kind of pattern, one that doesn't follow the usual idea of progress. It follows control. What stays visible, what gets removed, and what continues to exist without being acknowledged. And once you recognize that pattern here, it's hard not to wonder where else it shows up. At this point, it would be easy to assume the system eventually faded out completely, even if it lasted longer than expected. That would fit the pattern. Old infrastructure holding on for a while before finally disappearing. But that's not what happened. Because even after everything we've gone through, even after the public shutdown and the quiet continuation behind the scenes, parts of this system are still in place today. Not in the way they used to be, not at the same scale, but not gone either. There are still physical connections that exist between key locations, still maintained, still usable when needed. And that alone changes the conversation, because now we're not talking about history anymore. We're talking about something that crosses into the present. A system built in the 19th century, still considered useful enough to keep in certain critical paths. That doesn't happen by accident. It only happens when something continues to offer value that newer systems can't fully replace. And the reason given for keeping these connections is always the same: security. Not in the vague sense people throw around, but in a very specific, practical way. A physical message traveling through a closed system cannot be hacked remotely. It can't be intercepted through software, can't be copied silently, can't be altered without physically accessing the path it travels. In a world where almost all communication is digital, that difference matters more than ever, because every digital system, no matter how advanced, carries some level of vulnerability. There's always a point of entry, always a way in, if someone knows where to look. But a sealed physical system doesn't work like that. It either gets physically breached, which is obvious and difficult, or it continues to function as designed. That level of simplicity becomes an advantage over time, not a limitation. And that's why it still exists. Not because it's better in every way, but because in certain situations, it's more dependable. And when you're dealing with communication at the highest levels, dependability isn't optional. It's the baseline. So instead of replacing it completely, they kept it where it mattered most. Limited, controlled, out of sight, but ready. And that's the part that sticks. Not that it was built, not that it worked, but that after everything, it never fully went away. At first, you might think, if modern technology is so advanced, Why not just build something better and get rid of this old system completely? Why keep something that looks outdated on the surface? But that way of thinking assumes newer always means safer, and that's not always true. Digital systems are fast, flexible, and powerful, but they come with a trade-off. They rely on signals, networks, layers of software, and every layer is a point where something can go wrong. It doesn't have to fail completely to become unreliable. Even small disruptions can affect how information moves. Delays, interference, unauthorized access, all of these are real possibilities, even in well-protected systems. And the more complex something becomes, the harder it is to control every part of it. That's the reality people in critical positions have to deal with. They don't just need speed, they need certainty. They need a method that doesn't depend on multiple layers working perfectly at the same time. That's where this older system still holds its ground. It's simple in structure, but that simplicity removes a lot of risk. No remote access, no invisible interference, no silent copying of data. The message is physical, contained, moving through a path that's fixed and controlled. If something goes wrong, it's visible, it's tangible, and it can be addressed directly. That's a different kind of reliability, one that doesn't rely on trust in unseen processes. And that's why it hasn't been fully replaced. Not because it's better in every situation, but because in certain conditions it's more trustworthy, especially when the cost of failure is high. In those cases, redundancy isn't optional, it's necessary. You don't rely on one system, you keep multiple options available, each covering the weaknesses of the others. And this system, despite its age, covers a very specific weakness that modern communication still hasn't eliminated. That's why it stays. Quietly maintained, rarely mentioned, but always there as a fallback when everything else becomes uncertain. And that's the part most people don't consider. Not all old technology disappears because it stops working. Sometimes it stays because it solves a problem that newer systems still haven't fully fixed. At this point, calling the system old doesn't really mean much anymore, because age isn't the reason something becomes useless, and it's not the reason something stays either. What matters is whether it still solves a problem better than the alternatives in certain situations, and this system clearly does. It doesn't compete with modern communication in speed or convenience. It doesn't try to. It exists for a different purpose. When everything is running normally, digital systems take over, faster, easier, more flexible. But when conditions change, when reliability becomes more important than speed, when security matters more than convenience, that's when this system shows its value, and that's why it hasn't disappeared. Not because people forgot to remove it, but because they chose not to. There's a difference. Something that is neglected fades away. Something that is maintained, even quietly, is being kept for a reason. And here, the maintenance tells the real story. It means resources are still being used, people are still responsible for it, checks are still being done to make sure it works when needed. You don't do that for something you don't plan to use. And once you accept that, the idea of it being obsolete doesn't hold up the same way anymore. It might be outdated in public use, replaced by more convenient tools, but in its specific role, it's still relevant. And that changes how you look at the whole timeline. It's not a straight line from old to new, it's a split. One path moved forward into visible, everyday technology. The other stayed behind, refined, reduced, and kept out of sight for specific purposes. And both paths still exist at the same time. That's the part people don't usually consider. We tend to think progress replaces what came before, but sometimes it just hides it, leaves it running in the background, out of focus, while attention shifts to something else. And when that happens, the thing that was supposed to disappear doesn't actually go anywhere. It just becomes invisible to most people. Still there, still functioning, just no longer part of what we think of as the present. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking why it wasn't replaced. You start asking why it was kept. At first, it's easy to think this was something unique, something specific to Paris, because of its structure, its history, its need for control. But the moment you start looking outside that city, the pattern shows up again. Different places, different timelines, but the same idea. Systems built to move physical messages through controlled paths, bypassing the chaos above ground. London had it early on, connecting financial centers where timing mattered just as much. Berlin built a network that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, handling massive volumes of communication before eventually being shut down. Prague had its own version, smaller but still functional for decades. And then there's the United States, where the story takes a slightly different turn but leads to the same conclusion. New York built its own system, connecting post offices across the city, moving tens of thousands of letters every day through underground tubes. At one point, a significant portion of the city's mail depended on it. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. Different governments, different cities, all arriving at the same solution to the same problem. Move information physically through a controlled environment, avoid delays, avoid interference, keep things predictable. And just like in Paris, these systems didn't fail in some dramatic way. They weren't destroyed by disaster or rendered useless overnight. They were shut down, labeled obsolete, replaced in the public narrative by newer technology, and then slowly they faded from common awareness. Not because they never mattered, but because people stopped talking about them. That's the part that stands out. When something exists in multiple places, at scale, serving real needs for long periods of time, you expect it to stay in public memory. You expect it to be part of how we understand the development of communication. But that's not what happened here. These systems became footnotes, mentioned briefly, then ignored. And when a pattern like that repeats across different countries, different systems, it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like something we collectively moved past without really understanding what we were leaving behind. If Paris shows how a system like this can grow and stay hidden in plain sight, New York shows something else. How far people were willing to go to make it work, even when they weren't supposed to. There was a man, Alfred Ely Beach. Not a politician. Not someone in power. Just an inventor who believed the city needed a better way to move people underground. But the problem wasn't the idea, it was permission. The city leadership at the time had their own plans, and anything that threatened those plans wasn't going to get approved. So he did something simple, on paper, but bold in reality. He asked for permission to build a small pneumatic tube system, something harmless, something easy to approve. And once he had that permission, he didn't build what he said he would. He built something much bigger. Under the cover of night, quietly, without drawing attention, he started digging beneath the streets. Not a small tube, but a full tunnel, large enough to carry passengers. A working underground transport system, powered by air pressure. It wasn't long, just a few 100 feet, but it was real, functional, complete, and hidden until he chose to reveal it. When he finally opened it to the public, people didn't ignore it. They lined up, thousands of them, curious, excited, willing to pay, just to experience something they had never seen before. And for a moment, it worked, not as a secret anymore, but as proof that something like this was possible. But then reality caught up. Politics, money, control, all the things that decide what gets built and what doesn't. The project didn't expand. Funding disappeared. The system was shut down, sealed off, and eventually forgotten. Completely. Years passed. Decades. And then, long after the man who built it was gone, workers digging a new line broke through a wall and found it. The tunnel was still there, the structure intact. A piece of infrastructure that had existed, functioned, and then disappeared so completely that no one expected to find it again. That's the part that stays with you, not just that it was built, but that it could vanish from awareness while still physically existing beneath the city. And once you see that happen once, it becomes harder to dismiss the idea that there might be more things like it, still there, just not part of what people remember anymore. After looking at Paris and New York, one thing becomes hard to ignore. Infrastructure doesn't just vanish the way stories make it seem. When something is built underground, especially something complex, it doesn't simply get erased. It gets abandoned, sealed, covered over, but it's still there. Layers build on top of it, new systems come in, cities expand, people move on, and over time, what was once active becomes invisible. Not gone, just out of sight. And that changes how you think about everything beneath a city. Because once you accept that one hidden system existed and was forgotten, it's not a stretch to assume there could be others. Different purposes, different time periods, but the same pattern, built, used, then left behind without being fully removed. In a place like Paris, that idea goes even further. Beneath the streets, there are already known networks, old quarries turned into tunnels, sections of catacombs, sewer systems stretching for hundreds of kilometers, all of it layered together, intersecting in ways most people never see. And somewhere within that, for decades, These message tubes were running, moving information quietly through the same underground space. That's a lot of structure in one place, built over time, not all of it mapped clearly, not all of it accessible. And when you combine that with what we've already seen, systems that operated at scale and then faded from public awareness, it creates a different picture. Not a clean, organized city with a single layer of infrastructure, but a stacked environment, old and new coexisting, some active, some forgotten, some maybe still in use without being obvious. And that's where it shifts from history into something more uncertain. Because once you start thinking in layers like that, you realize how little of it is actually visible from the surface. People walk above it every day without knowing what runs underneath, what used to run, or what might still be connected in ways that aren't documented anymore. And that doesn't mean everything down there is secret or hidden on purpose. Sometimes it's just neglected, overlooked, left behind as the city moves forward. But the effect is the same. Large systems, real systems, slipping out of awareness while still physically existing. And when that happens enough times, it stops feeling like an exception. It starts feeling like a pattern. When you really start looking at what lies under a city like Paris, it stops feeling like a single system and starts looking like a layered world built over centuries. Not planned all at once, not designed as a whole, but added piece by piece as different needs came and went. Old quarry tunnels carved out to build the city itself, later abandoned and left empty. Catacombs filled with remains, stretching far beyond what tourists ever see. Sewer systems expanding to handle growth above. And running through all of that, at one point, the message network, weaving its way through the same underground space. These aren't small structures. They cover massive distances, intersecting, overlapping, sometimes connecting in ways that aren't fully documented anymore, and that's where it gets complicated. Because once you have that much infrastructure layered together, control becomes difficult. Not impossible, but incomplete. There are sections that are maintained, monitored, and mapped carefully. But there are also sections that are forgotten, sealed off, or simply ignored because they're no longer considered important. And in a system that large, not important, doesn't mean not there. It just means no one is paying attention to it. That creates gaps. Physical spaces that exist but aren't actively managed. Paths that might still connect to something else, even if no one uses them regularly. And when you think about that in the context of everything we've already seen, systems that were built, used, and then quietly pushed out of awareness, it starts to feel less like history and more like something still unfolding. Because the infrastructure didn't disappear. It accumulated. Layers on top of layers, each one representing a different time, a different need, a different way of solving problems. And all of it still sitting beneath the surface, mostly out of sight. People tend to think of a city as what they can see, buildings, roads, movement above ground. But underneath, there's another version of that city, older, more complex, and in some ways, less understood. And once you recognize that, it becomes harder to assume we know everything about how these places actually function, both in the past and right now. At some point, the idea that all of this is just abandoned stops making sense, because people don't leave spaces like that completely unused forever. Not all of it, not every section. When you have kilometers of tunnels, hidden access points, and paths that connect parts of a city in ways most people don't understand, someone is going to use them. Maybe not officially, maybe not openly, but they get used. And there have been cases that prove it. Spaces discovered underground that weren't supposed to be active anymore, but clearly were. Rooms set up with power, equipment, even basic living arrangements. Not random, not accidental, but intentional use of space that had been forgotten by most people. And the strange part isn't that these places exist, it's how organized they are when they're found. This isn't someone wandering around. This is people who understand the layout, who know where to go, how to get in, how to avoid being noticed. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from guessing. It comes from familiarity, from time spent, learning the system, exploring it, mapping it out in ways that aren't publicly documented. And once that idea settles in, it changes the way you look at the underground entirely. It's not just a leftover from the past, it's a space that can still be navigated, still be used, still be understood by a small group of people who know what they're doing. And those people don't need it to be recognized by the public. In fact, it works better if it isn't, because the moment something becomes widely known, it becomes restricted, monitored, controlled. But as long as it stays out of focus, it remains accessible in ways that official systems aren't. That creates a different kind of environment, one where knowledge matters more than permission. If you know the paths, you can move through them. If you don't, they might as well not exist. And that's a powerful difference, because it means there are parts of the city, real physical parts, that operate outside of normal awareness, not hidden in a dramatic way, just ignored enough to stay functional for those who understand them. And when you connect that idea back to everything else, the old networks, the systems that were supposed to be gone but weren't fully removed, it starts to feel less like isolated cases and more like a continuous thread. The infrastructure remains, and people find ways to use what remains, whether it was meant for them or not. Once you put all of this together, the structure, the hidden layers, the continued use, it leads to a simple but uncomfortable idea. Whoever understands what's below has an advantage over what happens above, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a practical sense. Movement, access, connection points, these are things that shape how a city functions, even if most people never think about them. Above ground, everything is visible, regulated, crowded. Below ground, it's different. Fewer people, fewer restrictions in certain areas, and more importantly, less attention. That alone creates opportunities. If you can move through a space that others don't even consider, you're operating on a different level. And it doesn't have to be for anything extreme. Even basic coordination becomes easier when you have paths that bypass the normal flow. But when you scale that idea up, when you think about institutions, governments, or any group that depends on secure movement of information, it becomes more serious. Because now it's not just about convenience, it's about control. Control over how information moves, where it goes, who sees it, and who doesn't. That's what these systems were always tied to from the beginning. Not just speed, not just efficiency, but controlled pathways that reduce exposure. And that concept doesn't go away just because technology changes. It adapts. Some of it moves into digital space, some of it stays physical, and some of it blends both. But the principle stays the same. Keep critical movement within systems you understand and can manage. And when those systems exist beneath everything else, they gain another layer of separation. They're not just secure because of how they work, they're secure because most people don't even think to look there. That's a powerful combination. And it explains why certain parts of these networks were never fully abandoned. Because giving up that level of control doesn't make sense for the people who depend on it. They might reduce it, limit access, stop talking about it publicly, but they don't remove it completely. They keep it in place, ready, maintained just enough to function when needed. And from the outside, it looks like progress moved on. But underneath, some of the most important pathways are still the ones built long ago, just used in ways that aren't obvious anymore. At this point, the biggest question isn't how the system worked, or why it was built. It's something simpler and harder to answer. How does something this large just disappear from common memory? We're not talking about a small experiment or a short-lived project. This was a city-wide network, used daily, moving millions of messages, integrated into real operations for decades. That kind of thing should leave a mark. It should be something people talk about, something that shows up in how we explain the evolution of communication. But it doesn't. Ask around, most people have never even heard of it. And that's not because the information is hidden. It's documented. Records exist, maps exist, descriptions exist. It's all there if you go looking for it. But that's the point. You have to go looking. It's not part of what people are naturally exposed to. It's not taught widely, not discussed often, not included in the main narrative. And over time, that's all it takes. If something isn't repeated, it fades. Not because it wasn't important, but because attention moved somewhere else. New technologies came in, faster, more visible, easier to explain, and they took over the story. People focused on what was in front of them and stopped thinking about what was underneath. And once that shift happens, memory follows it. The old system doesn't get erased. It just gets pushed to the side until it becomes background information, then forgotten entirely by most people. That's how it happens. Not through secrecy, not through some coordinated effort to hide it, but through neglect of attention. And in some ways, that's more effective. Because something that's hidden makes people curious. Something that's simply not talked about doesn't raise questions. It just fades out naturally. And when it's gone from everyday awareness, it might as well not exist for most people, even if it's still physically there. And that's the part that stands out. Not that it was forgotten, but how easily it was forgotten. Because if something this big can slip out of common memory in a relatively short time, then it raises a bigger question about what else might have followed the same path. Once you accept that something this massive can fade out of awareness, it changes how you look at everything else around it. Because now it's not just one system, it's the possibility that there are others, different forms, different purposes, built in different times, that followed the same path, used heavily, relied on, then slowly pushed out of focus as newer things took attention. And not all of them have to be as large or as obvious. Some could be smaller, more specialized, designed for very specific uses, which makes them even easier to overlook. The pattern doesn't require everything to be hidden on purpose. It only requires attention to move on. That's enough. Once people stop paying attention, systems lose their place in the story, even if they still exist physically or functionally in some limited way. And the more complex a city becomes, the easier it is for that to happen. Layers build up. New infrastructure covers old infrastructure. And over time, only the top layer stays visible in people's minds. Everything underneath becomes background, then eventually forgotten. And that creates a strange situation where parts of reality still exist, but aren't part of what people think about when they try to understand how things work. That gap between what exists and what is remembered is where things get lost. Not destroyed, not erased, just left out. And once something is left out long enough, it stops being questioned. People assume it's no longer relevant, or never was. But that assumption isn't always accurate. Because as we've seen, relevance doesn't always disappear when attention does. Some systems keep their value quietly, serving roles that don't need public visibility. And when that happens, they continue to operate in the background while everyone else focuses on something newer, something more obvious. That's why this isn't just about one forgotten network. It's about a way of looking at history that leaves gaps, not because information is missing, but because it's no longer part of the main conversation. And once you start noticing those gaps, it becomes harder to ignore the idea that what we remember isn't always the full picture. After everything, all the details, all the layers, all the pieces that don't quite fit the way we expect, it comes down to one thing that doesn't go away. Not a conclusion, not a clean ending, just a question that stays in the back of your mind. If something this real, this large, this integrated into daily life can fade out of common awareness so completely, then what else has followed the same path? Not in a dramatic way, not hidden behind locked doors, or protected by some complex secret, but simply left behind as attention moved on. Because that's all it takes. People focus on what's new, what's visible, what's easy to understand, and everything else slowly drops out of view. And when that happens, the world people think they understand becomes smaller than what actually exists. Not because information is missing, but because it's no longer being looked at. That's the part that feels different after going through all of this. It's not about proving anything extreme or uncovering something unbelievable. It's about recognizing how easy it is for real things to become invisible over time. Infrastructure, systems, methods that once mattered deeply, reduced to nothing more than a footnote, or even less than that. And once they reach that point, they stop being questioned. People assume they're gone, or irrelevant, or replaced completely. But as we've seen, that's not always true. Some things don't disappear, they just lose attention. And when they lose attention, they gain something else. Space to exist without being examined, without being challenged, without being fully understood by most people. That doesn't automatically make them important or dangerous. It just makes them there. Still part of the world, still connected to how things function in ways that aren't obvious anymore. And that's where the story really ends. Not with a reveal, not with a final answer, but with that shift in perspective. The understanding that what we see and what actually exists aren't always the same. And once you notice that gap, it's hard to ignore it. Because it doesn't just apply to one system, or one city, or one moment in history. It applies anywhere attention moves on and leaves something behind. And the only thing left to ask, really, is simple. What else are we not seeing right now?